Radical Love Live is a member of the Choircast Network. This is Radical Love Live, an ongoing series of conversations with thought leaders exploring faith outside the boxes, hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson.
Hey, Kelly.
Mark, how are you?
I am freaking awesome as always. And how about you, my friend?
I'm good. It's beautiful weather outside.
I know, right?
Yeah, I ran into a good buddy of mine over at the Wawa. Right?
I know, I heard. He's a pretty amazing fellow that you ran into.
Really, really
He looks a lot like me too, doesn't he?
Striking
It's
resemblance.
incredible. It was my doppelganger, wasn't it?
Apparently, we have the same good taste in lunch options. So
We scrambled to get something so we can make it into studio.
That's right.
So, well, it's good to see you, my friend.
Likewise,
So what are we doing today, my friend?
I'm really excited. that
Okay.
We are talking today with Justin Lee.
Yep.
And he is a nonprofit executive and author who uses nuance and empathy as tools for global change. Justin first gained an international following for his work as a Christian ministry leader, helping heal church and family divisions on LGBTQ issues. And today, Justin teaches audiences to apply the same powerful bridge-building techniques to all sorts of difficult issues, from political polarization to family disputes. And his first book was Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians Debate. And I understand that there's a new edition of that recently, an updated edition that came out. And his most recent book is Talking Across the Divide, How to Communicate with People You Disagree With and Maybe Even Change the World.
Oh, we definitely need that.
Right. And we're going to try to cover on both of those topics today. But I just want to give a little bit of background on having kind of a little bit of a fanboy moment that back in early 2000, I was doing research online, and this is, I'm at work, I've got the internet between projects. Because I always had an intuitive feeling that there was something not right about the way that I had learned the relationship between Christianity and sexuality. Like, it always just seemed wrong.
Joined the club, right? Millions of people, but you felt it. Like
it really, it was something that I was passionate about, disabusing people from the notions that they had about, who's in, who's out, what's sin and what's not. And in my
what's
research,
healthy sex, what's not, all of that.
Exactly. And in my research, I was fortunate enough to come across what was called the Great Debate, which was Justin and another scholar debating different positions on Christianity and sexuality and whether people who were gay, there was no real debate about whether, people were innately gay or not. It was more like, should gay Christians be celibate or should gay Christians, live fully? And it was a fantastic, I've gone back to this piece many times. And if you listen to our 4-part Pride Month series, I referenced Justin's work a lot. So anyway, that's a lot of preamble just to say, Justin, I'm really grateful that you're here. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here. Hi.
So let's get started off, just so our listeners know a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a little about your spiritual background and how you came to be interested and passionate about the topics that you're known for?
Yeah. When you were talking about the end of the 1900s, I was like, suddenly I'm feeling very old.
I have a 15-year-old who makes fun of me about that all the time. Like, what was it like back in the 1900s?
Back when I was a boy. So, I grew up at a time before the internet, back in those ancient days. And I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian family in the South. My family was wonderful. My parents were incredibly loving and just wonderful people. The church I grew up in was wonderful. I loved that community. One of the things that I was taught growing up in that kind of evangelical world was that homosexuality was a sin, that people chose to be gay, and that it was my responsibility as a Christian to speak out against the acceptance of, we didn't say LGBTQ then, but the acceptance of homosexuals in society. And we didn't think of that as a hateful thing. We didn't think of that as, we're against these people. We thought of this as we want people to be in line with God's will for their lives. And I thought, if society continues to accept homosexuality, then more and more young people are going to declare themselves gay, which is a choice and a sin. They're going to be separated from God's love. Their eternal souls could be in danger. It's my responsibility as a Christian to speak out against it. And so I did. That was one of a number of topics that I believed I was supposed to speak out against. And I was a very, very devout Christian, still am. And when I was in high school, in fact, I got the nickname God Boy from a classmate of mine because I was constantly preaching at everyone. He did not mean it as a compliment, but I absolutely took it as one. And so that was who I was. You can imagine the sort of person I might in another life have grown up to be. But the one big twist in my story is that from the time I hit puberty, when all my guy friends were starting to notice girls for the first time, I was starting to notice guys. And it took me until I was 18 to realize that I was gay, simply because I had always been taught that being gay was a choice. And so certainly it wasn't a choice I made. I was God Boy, you know. Gays and Christians had nothing in common, I thought. And so realizing that I was gay really turned my world upside down. And as I wrestled with what all this meant, should I join an ex-gay group, which were very popular at the time? Should I commit myself to lifelong celibacy? Had I misunderstood what the Bible had to say and I should support same-sex marriage? What did my future look like? What did I believe? I was also having to wrestle with, what about everything else that my church had taught me? And what about everything my parents had taught me? And I discovered on that path that a lot of folks I'd always looked up to didn't know how to respond to me. And in fact, a lot of them responded really badly. That just because I was asking these questions, even though I was still this very conservative, sheltered kid who'd never been in any kind of same-sex relationship and never kissed anybody. And I started to realize for the first time how the people I had preached at all these years growing up might have felt. And it gave me a completely different perspective, not only on this one particular topic, but on what we as Christians, and specifically the evangelicals I grew up with, what we were doing in society and how we were coming across that we didn't realize was how we were coming across. So where I ended up from that was, after years of wrestling with all this, I started writing about what I was going through online and began hearing from people all over the world who were in similar situations and were scared, people who, you know, pastors of large churches who had realized they were gay and couldn't tell anybody, parents and grandparents who couldn't tell anybody because they felt like, well, this is the life I've chosen, but I've never been attracted to my spouse. People who were on the verge of suicide and self-harm. And all of these people they felt like they couldn't talk to their churches. And yet they also didn't feel very connected to the sort of broader LGBTQ movement. And so I started an online community that became a nonprofit working to help bring people together, and did that for 16 years. And in that time, I ended up in a lot of different kinds of spaces. I started getting attention and people started asking me to speak to very conservative Christian audiences about gay people and then later about LGBTQ people. And I started getting invited to very progressive social justice spaces and asked to talk about these conservative evangelicals and what are they thinking and what are they doing over there. It showed me more and more how far apart we are on so many things. And so my whole career has been trying to bridge these divides between LGBTQ folks and Christians, but also more broadly on all kinds of political and social issues. How do we talk to each other better and understand each other, even on issues where we can't come to agreement?
Right. Wow, that's so important right now. And you know, as we reflect on the dialogue that exists in America, particularly now that there's so much of it happens online and on social media where people aren't talking face to face. So there's even less empathy than there would be at the Thanksgiving dinner table, because the anonymity of the screen kind of gives people license to say stuff that they never say. But it's almost like we live in different realities. It's not even just like I have a different opinion about something, but it's like I believe different things are true than you believe. And it's, how does one even start to build bridges in those conversations?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge up front is, as you said, we often believe different things are true. And not only that, we have not just different opinions, but really strongly beliefs about what is true and what is right. And that might sound obvious, but we have to acknowledge that up front because it is such a key part of why it's difficult for us to dialogue. Because often when you talk about dialogue or nuance or let's try to understand each other, what people on both sides hear is we're trying to compromise, that we are, we're saying that your view and my view are both equally valid opinions. And if I don't think your view is an equally valid opinion, if I think I am standing for what is true and you're standing for something that's false, or I'm standing for something that is morally right and you're standing for something that's morally wrong, that may be harming people, then I'm not interested in compromise. I'm not interested in, well, let's arrive at a place halfway between right and wrong, halfway between true and false.
Right.
I think, well, I need to take the strongest possible position against you. And so we have to hold this tension of, on the one hand, yeah, that makes sense. That's totally reasonable that we can't compromise on matters of truth and matters of rightness and morality. But that at the same time, I can understand that you also believe you're right. It doesn't mean we're both equally right. One of us has to be wrong on many issues. I can believe that you're wrong and also believe that you're right. And so if I want to win you over and I want to convince you that you're actually wrong, I need to first understand something about what's going on in your head, what truths you've heard, what you think is true, what you think you're fighting for, why it matters to you, what you've been through. Because if I don't care enough to listen to any of that, I'm not going to get anywhere with you. And then I'm just going to leave the conversation angry and convinced that you are stubborn, and you're going to leave angry and convinced that I'm stubborn, and we've just gotten further apart than we started.
Right. I remember back in the years, I fancied myself like a political blogger. And I really had this idea of like, if we only put the truth out there, if we only give people access to the truth, they'll see it. Got my ass handed over and over again. Like people who are well-educated people who just simply had a completely different worldview. Yep. It wasn't that they were dumb or deceived or whatever, but just there was like some very essential core beliefs. And that happens also in now that my focus is more on religion, when we talk about, say, accepting, being inclusive of LGBTQ people, accepting same-sex marriage, and people are like, there are 4 Bible verses that are very clear about this, and I don't care how much I like those people, I can't get around these 4 Bible verses. The Bible says it, and therefore, end of discussion.
Which is, of course, going down that rabbit hole a little bit to me is like, okay, do you believe everything else too? But,
right. Yeah. People don't often respond well to
they
that.
Don't like
They're
that.
like, how do you handle this? Do you put striped sticks in front of your goats to get them to be born in certain colors? Or, how many pillars are under the earth? But they didn't really respond well to that.
This is actually...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Please, go on.
Well, I was going to say, so it's interesting that you bring that up, because this is actually one of the examples that I give in my book, Talking Across the Divide, which is not written specifically for a religious audience, but I do talk a little bit about my work in religious spaces. So I had a friend who was arguing with a family member about the Bible and what the Bible said. And so my friend's family member was saying, well, the Bible's very clear on homosexuality and da-da-da-da-da. And my friend responded with a similar kind of, well, do you really believe everything, whatever? And I said to my friend, that is actually the moment when you lost the argument.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because what you've just done, without meaning to, is taken a disagreement on the interpretation of these passages and what they mean in a specific context for specific people, and turned it into a disagreement about whether or not the Bible is trustworthy. And so what you're trying to say is, I want you to interpret the Bible differently, take a different approach to the Bible. But what your brother is hearing is, I don't believe the Bible. You believe the Bible, like literally, and I don't believe the Bible literally. And so in order for you to accept my position on same-sex marriage, you have to abandon your entire view of Scripture, your entire theological worldview. And so somehow we have to find a way, when we're having these kind of conversations, to figure out, how do I reach this person within their worldview, even if I completely disagree with their worldview, even if I think that their worldview is based on something, a bunch of false stuff. How do I reach them where they are to begin this conversation? Because you can't just kind of like uproot their entire tree of beliefs, with your bare hands all at once.
Absolutely. Very well said. So to that end, what is your answer to that? Because that is, I think, the default for people to just go, well, blah, blah. How do you respond to that?
No, my short answer to that, which is by necessity oversimplified. is I think there are two key things that we need to do a lot more of. The first one is listening, and the second one is storytelling. And so I always tell people, when you enter one of these conversations, often you can be in a position where you have no desire to listen to what the other person has to say because you've already heard them talk about this issue many times. You've heard other people who have the same position talk about it many times. You know that you know more about it than they do. I'm in this position very often as a gay Christian when other Christians say to me, oh, you know, you can't be gay and Christian. The minute they say that, I already know that I have spent years and years and years thinking about this beyond what they've spent. You know, this is my life.
It's your lived experience. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know that whatever they're about to say, I've heard it probably 1,000 or more times before. But there is still value in stopping and listening to them first, because even though they're unlikely to say anything I haven't heard before, by listening to them, I find out what's led them to the position that they hold. And I can ask questions about not just what do you believe, but like, tell me when you first started thinking about this. Where were you when you first started hearing about gay people or LGBTQ people or homosexuality or whatever? Who are the people who've shaped you? What are the experiences that have shaped your view? Did you ever wonder if you were wrong, and what convinced you that you weren't wrong, or what changed your mind at some point? I can hear their unique story. And that tells me a lot about what this is really about for them. Is it really about whether I believe the Bible or not? Is it really about a cultural slide away from God that they're worried about? What's going on for them? And I also can learn if they have misconceptions that need to be corrected. Maybe we don't agree on what gay means. Maybe they think it's a choice and I think it's not a choice. Well, we're going to have to address that at some point. I show them that I care, that I'm interested, that they're not going to have to fight me in order to be heard. And it makes it way more likely that once they feel that I've actually heard them, they will do the same in return and ask me to share my view, and that they'll actually listen. And it doesn't always happen, but it happens way more often if you've listened to them than if you haven't. And then when they do listen, I encourage people not just to make arguments, because arguments, in my experience, very rarely change minds, even if they're really good arguments, but rather tell stories. And so rather than get into an argument with people about what this Bible passage means or what that Bible passage means, even though I think that's really important as a Christian who believes the Bible, I always start with, let me tell you my story, and let me tell you what I've been through, and let me tell you how what changed my mind and why, and the stuff that I went through. Because I find that after people have heard my story, even if they don't agree with me, their first response is, wow, I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that before. It gives me new empathy for somebody in your position. It makes me think about this in a different way. And that gives them then a motivation to be interested enough to go back to scripture and say, well, let me just double check. Did I get any of this wrong?
Wow, well said.
I've been thinking about this.
In your book, Crossing the Divide, I assume that this is a part of having these kinds of conversations where there's going to be a challenge in different points of view. But you're right. If you just listen to them and let them tell their story and then you share, you're going to find common ground in there. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges that I see, because I know I've heard so many times that stories are so effective, and say with LGBTQ inclusion, that people who know somebody who's gay are a lot more likely to have a more open view than people who don't. And there are regions of the country where people are very homogenous within a certain group, and they don't talk to anybody they don't talk to people of color, they don't talk to people of different religions, they don't talk to people of different sexual orientations that they know of. That's a challenge for people who don't really have access to people who have different ideas. I always hope that the internet would open that up too, and it seems to create echo chambers instead. But how do we share those stories with people who are in communities where they're not kind of getting out much?
Yeah, it's challenging. When you talk about the echo chambers, there's a book out by a journalist named Max Fisher called The Chaos Machine. And honestly, it's one of the scariest things I've ever read in my life. And I know that doesn't sound like a great endorsement at a time when people are tired of being scared by the news. If Stephen King isn't doing it for you anymore and you need a reason to be scared, read The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher. He documents very thoroughly what's happened with social media and gives some really scary examples of ways that social media platforms have gone into parts of the world where there were some underlying tensions, racial tensions, religious tensions, whatever that existed, but people were coexisting. And then social media comes in and blows it all up and turns into all out war.
Absolutely. Myanmar is a
And
classic example of that. Look what happened with Facebook in Myanmar. Many people died.
exactly. And so what we're finding is that for a lot of reasons, but in part because social media algorithms have been designed to maximize engagement, and things that make you afraid or angry or both are more engaging than things that don't. AI, without understanding what it's doing, has stumbled into this way of getting us all hooked on these platforms by giving us the most outrageous stuff all the time. So it's a problem. But I do think that compelling stories still have a way of reaching people. If we can make them engaging, make them interesting. One of the ways that I've done this is I wrote a book. I put my story in a book. And when I wrote Torn, I didn't just write it as some kind of memoir, because who cares what some guy named Justin Lee, experienced. But what I tried to do, after having been in ministry for a lot of years and having a lot of people ask me the same questions over and over, was tell my story in a way that I slowly answer those questions in a way that makes sense. So when you read Torn, it starts off establishing that, I really, for an evangelical audience especially, I'm a Christian like you. This is the background I come from. This is what's important to me. And then, plot twist, I realized that I was different from other boys. So then what happened? And then, you might think I would go to ex-gay ministries. So I did look into ex-gay ministries, and here's what's happened. Here's what happened and why it didn't work, and so on and so forth. And I slowly build up towards the end of the book where I'm able to get more into some of the Bible stuff and all of that. But it's a way of telling a story that engages people and answers their questions, and that they can get something out of it. And I've done the same thing with YouTube. You guys, when you're doing this podcast on YouTube, on podcasting software, wherever people find you, you're sharing people's stories and you're having conversations in a way that people can engage with. And it's tricky because sometimes we end up just talking to our own people, but then those people can take those stories out and they can say to their family members and their friends, actually, if you're interested in this subject, you should listen to this podcast, or you should watch this YouTube video or read this book.
Very well said. Your book Torn, so it originally came out in 2012?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you've released an updated version.
Thank you.
While we were talking, I was like, Amazon, I got to order that one.
This is what the new edition looks like. The old edition has a different cover.
I have to replace all the copies of the old edition that I've sent to people.
Right. Well, there you go.
Send me anti-gay Christian books.
Just order it on Amazon. It could be at your house tomorrow morning.
And it's there.
So I'm thinking about as you were explaining why you wrote your book, and I was looking at the chapters and refreshing my memory because it's been a while since I've seen the first edition. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You do this. A project that I founded, Divine All Along. One of the things that's in its core platform offering is Reclaim Your Divinity. It's for people who get hurt by church, right? And so they're subjected to religious abuse and trauma, and they've detached from their faith because of course, they got hurt. And I'm thinking, well, I wonder if his book would be a good book for somebody who is in that circumstance to read. Do you look at what you do? Did you ever have to question your own faith and divinity? Or is that a part of your story inside of that book?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I think I did have some real struggles in terms of figuring out what I believed and where is God in all of this? Do I believe in God still? Who do I trust? As I said earlier, that was certainly a part of my story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the audience matters. So when I wrote Torn, my primary audience for Torn is those more theologically conservative Christians out there who don't spend a lot of time with LGBTQ folks, haven't heard a lot of our stories. I tell the story at the very beginning of the book of a mom who called me, and her whole world was kind of falling apart because her son had just come out to her and she didn't know what to do. And I kept that mom in my mind the whole time I was writing this book. I sort of felt like I'm writing to that mom and to all the other parents out there who are in that position. and lots of other people who aren't parents, but that was sort of my reference. I've heard from folks who are not Christians anymore, who grew up in a Christian environment, who've read Torn and liked it. I've also heard from folks who say, gosh, it's really hard for me to read that because your language feels very evangelical to me, and the evangelical church is what really hurt me. And so it's very triggering for me. And I think it just depends on the person.
Sure.
I've given talks to audiences like that where I use really different language. I talk about things in a really different way because I know that's, where they are.
Yep.
So, and just, it depends. A reminder that there are different groups of people who have different needs. And sometimes the same resource isn't going to be what everybody needs. There are going to be people who connect with your podcast who are not going to connect with something that I've done, or going to connect with something I've done, but not connect with something else out there. And we need all of this out there for folks who are in different places, who've been on different journeys, and who need to hear from folks who get where they are.
I think it's really important what you were talking about earlier, that, I come from a very conservative evangelical background, but now I'm in a very progressive, like gay affirming, everybody's welcome type church environment, is not forgetting what the evangelical mindset, and not becoming so ex-evangelical that I kind of other those people. Because I find myself communicating as much to, say, Episcopalian about what Baptists are like, as opposed to communicating to Baptists about what Episcopalians are like. Because it's like, whoa. We can't they're not just like the bumbling henchmen of some evil supervillain. There's a biblical worldview. And Justin, what you were talking about earlier, there are some ways in which they think they're helping people by doing this. They're preventing people from sinning, therefore helping them get into heaven, or whatever their particular eschatology is, but just not forgetting those connections, because it's so easy to other the people that we disagree with.
Yes.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that's a really excellent point. I think for those of us who, as you said, have been part of one group, whether that's a religious group, whether that's a political group, you grew up in a family that leaned this way politically, and now you're on the other side of the aisle, whatever. It is often so easy to get into our new echo chamber where everyone agrees that those people are just all villains. And we gain credibility with our new echo chamber by villainizing and demonizing those other people. But that doesn't help us to reach those other people. And in fact, it makes those other people even more convinced that they want nothing to do with us, because if we think they're villains, then they think we're villains.
Of course.
And I think those of us who have been on both sides of a divide like that have a lot of power to help increase understanding. And you can say, they're totally wrong, but I used to be one of those folks. And because I used to be one of those folks, I know that they're not all terrible people. I understand why they do what they do. Let me help you, people who are on my new side, understand them. And maybe I can help translate some of our ideas to reach that crowd as well, if that's something that resonates with you. Not everybody wants to be in that space, but I think those of us who are able to, it's a really powerful thing to do in this divided world.
Justin, I have a question. When the work you do and people find out about you, your life, and the things that you're putting out in this world, and you said also you talk to a variety of audiences, and specifically when the question is framed around queer folks, when you are talking to the audience with them, do you affirm your own Christianity with them, and or do you hide your light under the bushel? And I ask that because there's so many folks that I encounter in my own personal that they really are very anti-religion, right, because of what's been done to them. And I'm thinking, a spiritual advisor recently told me, he's like, you can't hide your light under the bushel. Even there's ways to talk through, know your audience, of course, but you really can't hide your light. So I'm curious, how do you do this?
Oh, that's a really good question, because it is tricky. Coming from a Christian perspective, you've got that great passage from Paul where, with the Jews, I'm a Jew, with the Gentiles, I'm a Gentile.
All things to all people.
Yeah. So there is that sense in which when you're speaking to an audience, it is often unhelpful to emphasize the ways that you're different from them, and helpful to emphasize the ways in which you're similar. I think that is just wise with any group of people. by the same token, I think it's possible to take that too far to the point where you become kind of two-faced. And
Mhm.
I've seen people in their eagerness to be liked by people on different sides of an issue, they try to be just, a mirror or just show everybody that, oh, I'm with you, I'm with you. And when people start to see that, then they become suspicious of your motives. They think that you're not genuine. I think that's not helpful.
Yeah.
So it depends a lot on the situation, but I don't usually start off conversations by talking about all the ways in which my identity is, everything that the person I'm talking to hates. But I'm not, so like in my second book, Talking Across the Divide, my first book was written to a Christian audience. Talking Across the Divide was not written to a Christian audience, but I am open about being a Christian because it's part of my story. It's part of how I got into this kind of bridge building. I have stories about building bridges on LGBTQ issues with Christian audiences, and my being a Christian, and in particular an evangelical, is an essential part of that story. That said, at a time when the word evangelical is becoming more and more toxic, I find it more and more difficult to use without cringing, because I think it's an accurate identifier of the kind of flavor of Christianity that I come from. But I also am aware that it reads really differently to a lot of people. And a lot of people, if they hear me say I'm an evangelical, they interpret that in a lot of ways that would not be what I am trying to say.
Yep.
Yeah, and the media has really branded or started to brand evangelical as almost more as a political party than
Yep. Well, it's
Yeah.
easy for them to do that, right? Because they're always looking for something that it piques their interest and it keeps them attuned in, but it also just conflates it, right?
Right. It's quick, easy shorthand,
Absolutely.
evangelicals. I'm old enough that when I was growing up, we didn't use that term evangelical that way. We were fundamentalists, and proudly so. We were just like, we're the real deal.
You're the real deal. That's right.
And it's interesting with generations how, terms like that, you remember what it meant when you were growing up, but like to another generation, it means something different.
Totally.
I was just talking to some friends about this with regard to the word queer and how different people have really, really strongly divergent views about the word queer. Not only kind of the history that word has of being used as an insult, which a lot of people will bring up to explain that, but also it had a really strong political flavor for a long time. You look at the word queer in the 90s and how people were using it, it was a divisive term among the group we would now think of as LGBTQ people. And so depending on how old you are, you may have more or less sense of that. Or when you began to sort of openly be part of that community, that can change. So words are tricky.
With Divine all along, like talking to church audience, like really progressive, totally liberal, older people, that are like queer. Like I that word, like I was not to use that word.
Exactly. I've been asked about that multiple times, and Kelly was witness to that, where I did a presentation and I saw lots of wide eyes because I use that as part of the foundation. We are here to end religious abuse for our queer family.
Really well-meaning, like 70 and 80-year-olds who are just like aghast, because they want to be kind. So it's interesting.
They'll come over and ask afterwards, like, we can use that word? And I was like, yes, you can use that word.
So when you talk about talking across the divide, you've been talking with groups that are not religious groups. So are you navigating politics? Is that kind of largely the area where you're working now, or are there other arenas?
Often politics, if not explicitly, is at least sort of underlying a lot of the questions that I get. It's hard to talk about polarization and division in modern society and not be thinking about politics, particularly because everything is political these days.
Isn't it, though?
Yeah.
And I don't want to go down too much of a political rabbit hole here, but I think it's particularly telling during the COVID pandemic how something as apparently black and white as like, what do we know and what do we not know? How many people are dying? How deadly is this? Is this vaccine or wearing this mask helpful or unhelpful? These are things that sometimes we don't know the answer, but at least to what extent we do, it should be a clear answer you would expect. And we should all be on the same page. We all do not want to die of this, you know. And yet so much of it became very political, where, you know, in many communities, whether you were seen wearing a mask or not in public at certain times was a political statement. And we judged one another based on that.
Sure
and that's scary because, you know, when it comes to how we protect ourselves and our loved ones, we don't want that to be about politics. You know, we want that to be about what's true, what works and what doesn't, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, politics plays into a lot of it, but it's not just about politics. I mean, I get invited to speak to all kinds of different groups on all kinds of different issues where they're saying we are struggling in our profession, in our community, or sometimes in our church. We're struggling to talk to each other. We're struggling to talk to the people outside, you know, the clients we work with. We find that all of a sudden, you know, we're trying to help people with their healthcare. We're trying to help people with government planning of things, whatever. And we're encountering people who don't want to listen to us and see us as being the enemy because they think we're on the other side of a political aisle or something, and we're not. But how do we talk to them? And so I'm trying to help people bridge those kinds of divides.
Wow. I'm sure you have a long list of clients at this point, because I'm thinking you're absolutely right. And you said something even in intra-community where you can have a breakdown amongst that, and it's happening in congregations, you know, where there's been that, or it could be in workspaces where in some places it's unavoidable to where you can have some contrast, right? In a workspace, it's controlled, right? Like in the organization that I work for as a leader in this organization, there are clearly things that we know to discuss and things that are absolutely not okay to discuss. And politics is one of those. Like, we do not discuss politics. I don't do it with my team. I don't with my management, you know, the whole thing. But in other places, no, that stuff is the kind of stuff, you know, the community can start breaking down because they don't know how to, well, to your point, they don't know how to have these kinds of conversations, because we always have to look at things as black, white, good, bad, all of that. And so people have to be in one camp or the other.
Which, again, makes things difficult for those folks who are kind of crossing from one, you know, you grow up in a particular space and you realize, oh, I'm not real thrilled with everything going on here. And so you cross over, but then it feels like the only option is now you have to go as far as you can in the other,
exactly.
in the other direction.
Yeah, right. You have to, all of a sudden now you're in a completely different mindset. And it's like, wow, what happened to the nuance, right? Yeah. The word you use, like, there can be a little bit of both and here. So
yeah, I often wonder if people really are as starkly polarized as they seem, you know, through the media, or if there's really a spectrum of beliefs, but there's kind of only two homes to go to. So you kind of got to pick one or the other. And if you're in the middle, you're sort of without a tribe or without a country.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think social media is making that so much worse because, you know, going back to these algorithms, what these algorithms do is they figure out which way you lean on something, and then they hit you with as much content as possible that reinforces that view and makes the other side look like crazy extremists. And so I don't think it's really that most people don't want moderation and nuance and whatever. I think it's that what's happening is our view of the world has been so shaped by politically divided news sources and algorithms and echo chambers that we see the people on the other side of the divide as so extreme that we can't imagine it, you know, trying to find any kind of moderation feels like, you know, it's asking you to find some kind of middle ground with Hitler or something.
You have democracy indeed.
Yeah. Why would I want that? And some of the issues that we disagree on are legitimately important issues. And so I'm not saying that the issues aren't important, but there are people who may disagree with us on the issues, not because they themselves are so extremist, but because they've been misled about what the actual situation is. Right. And I find so often with politics, you see this all the time, those of us who pay attention to different news sources, both traditional media and online media, we have such vastly, and this goes back to something you said earlier, such vastly different ideas of what the facts are, that the conversation we think we're having is not the conversation. Like, we're having two different conversations. We're talking right past each other because I think that I'm arguing for something really reasonable and that you're arguing for some crazy thing, and you think the opposite about people like me. And so how do we then find any kind of common ground? How do we work forward unless we can break down these echo chambers somehow?
Yeah. So Justin, this work you're doing is obviously needed. How exactly do people connect with you and get involved? And what are you doing with the book? Is there a program that you're doing? How kind of walk us through this? If I was a part of a committee and I was like, yeah, we need your help. How's that work?
Yeah. So I've got these 2 books out. Torn, which as we talked about is out in a new, for the folks who have video, I'll hold these up. Torn, this is the new edition that just came out, 2024. It's called Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians Debate. The new edition is expanded, has some more chapters that were not in the first edition, and it talks more about things like gender identity that I didn't get into in the first edition.
Well done.
That's so important.
Yep,
It's such a hot button these days.
When the first book came out, more than 10 years ago, it was not as much part of the broader cultural conversation. I mean, it certainly was in some places, but not as much. And the gay piece of it was already controversial enough that I didn't want to go too far, but it felt like this was the time to expand that discussion.
Right.
My other book, Talking Across the Divide, deals more broadly with how we have these kinds of conversations on all sorts of issues. And it goes into really practical step-by-step. Here's what you do. You have someone in your life who you would like to talk to, and you cannot because it feels like you're always hitting a brick wall. Here are things to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, based on my experience over the last 25 years doing this.
Yeah.
I dig into a lot of the psychology of what's going on with people. Why don't they listen? And how do you get past that? I've got both of those books out there. People who want to bring me in to speak or whatnot can contact me through my website. I also have a YouTube channel where I post videos on this content from time to time. Both my website and my YouTube channel are Geeky Justin, Geeky, because I'm a huge geek. So geekyjustin.com is my website. Geeky Justin is my YouTube channel.
Yep.
2 notice figurines in the background.
Come on now. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to leave that alone. It's like, really? You're geeky? And then I'm looking at it. So thanks. Yes. Keep going.
If you watch any of my YouTube videos, you will see I have a whole wall of geek behind me, including I'm a nerd about a lot of things, including the video game series Portal. For those Portal fans out there, I made 2 of my books. I put portals in them, and I've got a Chell Portal figurine who's like blown a portal in one book and is going from one book to the other. I have lots of fun stuff behind me. So. But I always have to spell geeky for people because ever since a few years ago, I was speaking somewhere. I didn't have slides for this particular presentation, and I said, you can find me at geekyjustin.com. And I had this guy who came up to me afterwards and he said, did you say kinkyjustin.com?
I love
And
it.
ever since I've had to say, no, let me spell. So then I told this story at a
Let's go to kinkyjustin.com and see what happens.
No, so this is the thing. I told this story a few months back and someone bought the domain Kinky Justin and redirected to my website. So
it's awesome.
I don't know.
That
was great.
Yep.
So
they did you a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sell some ad space there.
Oh, that's
but
awesome.
Yeah, so that's, people can get in touch with me, contact me if you want me to come speak. And I've got a lot of stuff, a lot of resources on there in terms of the Bible, LGBTQ stuff, and bridge building stuff. So happy to be a resource however I can.
Yeah, and the older stuff really holds up too.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we are at time, but really, really grateful to be able to connect with you and talk with you. And we hope we can have you back on to talk some more sometime soon.
Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for all you're doing.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. Recorded at the Bravery Studios in Garfield, New Jersey. All rights reserved. Find our episodes on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And check us out at radicallovelive.com, along with our personal websites at markdilcom.com and kellywilson.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.